Yes. So thank you for joining this important call. I think this is a very important topic to discuss. One of the major stars with five-star women of color is around financial wellness, being financially secure. So that dives right into the topic tonight around Black women's equal pay. So I just want to thank everyone for being on the call. I definitely want to thank Dr. Crystal Francis for taking time out this evening to enlighten us with this information. And I'm going to turn it back over to Makeda.
Great. Thank you so much, Shaliba. I just would like to share some information with everyone about Dr. Francis. Her name is Dr. Crystal Francis, and she's passionate about advancing positive social change with a particular focus on equity and access for women and African Americans. She leverages her expertise as a program manager, policy consultant, and public speaker. Dr. Francis is dedicated to addressing the stigmatizing effects of poverty, homelessness, and mass incarceration in America. In her role as Vice President of the Maryland Alliance for Justice Reform, Dr. Francis leads the largest grassroots criminal justice advocacy nonprofit in Maryland. Her work is instrumental in improving public safety and ending unnecessary incarceration in the state. She serves as the community representative for Baltimore County's Equitable Policing Advisory Council, playing a pivotal role in reforming community policing practices, particularly within communities of color. Dr. Francis's expertise is not limited to state level advocacy though. She has a 15-year tenure leading reforms to address equal pay and equity issues in the federal space as the chairwoman of the Baltimore Federal Executives Board Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, advancing the White House's diversity agenda at the local level for 26 federal agencies across 9 counties. She possesses valuable experience in advocating for workplace fairness, having been involved in a class action settlement that stemmed from a case against the Social Security Administration for discrimination against Black women seeking to advance their careers and attain senior executive roles. Dr. Crystal holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, a master's in Homeland Security Management from Towson University, and a PhD in Public Policy and Administration from Walden University. And she is a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and the Fulbright Association. So we are very fortunate and very happy to have Dr. Francis with us here today to discuss Black women's equal pay. So thank you. And with that, I will let you have the floor, Dr. Francis.
Yes, thank you so much, Makeda, and thank you, Five Star Women, for all that you are doing to not only shed light on this important issue, but for the work that you're doing in the community to shed light on many issues that face African American women and our communities at large. It's my privilege to be here today. I am excited to talk about the wealth and wage gap as it pertains to women, specifically Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other women of color. And we all already know that it is a critical issue that affects not only our lives, but countless lives in our society because of the buying power of Black women, how it impacts our gross domestic product and how it impacts the tax advantage that our local counties see as it pertains to down to the zip code. And so before we delve into, I guess, the questions, because I would like to have as much interaction as possible, I want to kind of frame the status of where we are and the urgent need for a solution to this issue. So we already know, many of us already know that women who are working a full-time job year-round make approximately 84 cents to the dollar earned by men working full-time year-round. But when we look further down into that statistic, Black women are making 67 cents to the dollar. Hispanic women are making 57 cents to that dollar. And Asian women are making 92 cents to that dollar. So even within our minority demographic, there are still a vast number of disparities from women to men. And as a result of that, a Black woman working full-time for an employer has to work almost 2 years, 20 months to be exact, to earn the same salary of a Caucasian male that works for 12 months. And that's a challenge. That is a problem, because what it ends up doing, it impacts, if you look at it from the entire career span, Black women's average working career span is been categorized as a 40-year career. And the Center of American Progress noted that Black women lose over their career span an estimated $964,000 to the wage gap, which is a serious issue. Not only does it impact our ability to move up, it impacts our ability to contribute to our lineage and the generations to come as we share our wealth down. So these disparities are not only present for women who are working for employers, it's also present for women who are entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs, particularly in the startup space. You know, many people use the entrepreneurship path to try to change that wealth wage gap statistic, but because African American women face challenges in the wage gap when they are an employee, the challenge of becoming an entrepreneur is even harder. Not to mention, there are many programs, and many of you know what's going on with the Supreme Court ruling and I'm going to use affirmative action in my air quotes, how they struck down programming relative to affirmative action in education. And I'll talk how that's trickling down. The impact is trickling down to the corporate space and to the venture capital space. But Black women-owned businesses receive less than 1% of $288 billion from venture capital firms that were deployed the last 2 years. Less than 1%, 0.39% to be exact, which is alarming. Less than 10% of diversity investment checks that are supposed to be earmarked specifically for women-owned or other, they call it diversity investment checks, other minorities, Black, Hispanic, Asian, 79% of that seed funding for diversity founders goes to white women, and Black women receive less than 10%. So this is extremely important, because what's happening is, because Black women-owned businesses cannot get equitable access to the venture capital, they aren't able to grow their businesses. So as a result, they're being shut out of government contracts and grant opportunities that require a certain level of revenue to be earned. And so it's so important that we look at this issue and understand the urgency of why we have to act now, and we must continue to act to ensure that there is a fair resolution to be able to move the needle. Now, we've been talking about, you know, the wealth wage gap for over 20 years, and many people rely on our congressional representatives to solve the problem. And later on, I'll talk about other ways that we can help move the needle outside of the policy space. But the policy space is where we need the needle to move significantly. So to address this issue, we have to first understand the causes of the wage gap for Black women. And it's attributed to multiple factors: discrimination, occupational segregation, a lack of access to education and economic opportunities. And what's happening is this cycle of being blocked out of spaces to help us advance. We can't really break free from this cycle. And so what's happening, if you look at it on the state level, and I know Wes Moore, the governor here in the state of Maryland, had accelerated the $15 minimum wage here in the state of Maryland so it can be realized earlier. But in Vermont, for example, a woman working full-time made 93% to men working year-round. And that is because of the state and local level policies that have been implemented to help women get to a fair, equal wage faster. But there's a 30% unexplained in the data where it's contributed to discrimination, to be frank, and other measured incomes. And I'll talk about that a little bit, how this has impacted women's ability psychologically to even try to progress and move up, because they see discrimination and they've been trying and constantly have failed at trying to move up. So when we talk about the impact and the consequences of this wage gap, what we need to understand is that it's impacting not only our financial stability, but our ability to provide for our families, to save for the future, to invest in businesses. And so it's so important that we pay attention to how we personally are approaching our own career advancement and personal growth potential. I want to talk a little bit about the interconnected inequities, because as I mentioned earlier about how the venture capital lack of access to venture capital firms, that limited access to capital also impacts Black-owned businesses' ability to hire. And we know that if we want to advance and keep those jobs in our communities, we have to provide access to capital so that Black women can grow and develop businesses and be able to compete in the spaces with larger corporate institutions like Microsoft and Google and Amazon. And so there are a couple of ways to address this issue. One, we know that it's a public policy issue. And if you don't know, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 made it illegal for employers to pay unequal wages to men and women who are performing the same equal work. And so right now there is a move in Congress to pass, again, it's called the Paycheck Fairness Act. It's Senate Bill 728 and House Resolution 17. And what that's doing is helping to hold agencies and organizations accountable for not paying women and men equal wages. But we can't just, stop there with the public policy resolution, because when we talk about employment segregation and workplace segregation, what that really means is we need to look at the types of jobs overall that Black women are aspiring to and the cap of those jobs. For example, people that are in the medical practice, such as our surgeons, people in the science, technology, engineering, and agriculture space. People don't know you may or may not know that right now there is a funding pool to help women and minorities become farmers. There is a lack of presence for Black-owned businesses in that space. And so there are lots of resources that continue to be out there to help Black women and Black people in general resolve the wage and wealth gap. And we need to make sure that on the community level that we're doing our part to educate the community on what resources are actually available. Now, as it pertains to employers in general, to tackle the issue with discrimination, there are a couple of things we have to do. We have to address the stereotypes. Okay, women have always proven their capability time and time again, and oftentimes what happens is you'll see women who are overqualified for a position, and when it's time for a promotion, they're continuing to be passed up and passed by. And when we look at what our Caucasian male counterparts who may not have the level of education or experience, but they are seeming to move on quicker, what they're doing is using what we call in the corporate space is called mentorship, allyship, or sponsorship, where they develop a relationship with someone in a position of power, a senior executive role, who then becomes their sponsor and helps them move up the chain quicker on the basis of that relationship. And so when we talk about what we need to do, especially when we are, taking a job on for the first time, when we're in interviews, we need to teach ourselves and our children how to negotiate for a salary. I know that can be scary sometimes because we walk into a room and we're wondering, if I ask for a salary that may be too high, or are they going to select me? But that is another pathway to block or to supersede the wealth wage gap, because there was a policy that was recently passed that prohibited employers. They can no longer ask, and you may have noticed if you've been in the job seeking space within the past 5 years, that they no longer are allowed to ask what your pay history was, because what was happening is employers were using that as a way to keep people blocked in and boxed into salaries. They wouldn't pay you over 5% of what you were already making. So I'm going to, I see some questions in the chat, and yes, oh, this is a great question. I'm going to address that. So the first question is, how do we as Black women address imposter syndrome? That is a great question. So the first thing, there was a study that was done, and this was general to women, where 50% of women would not apply for a job that they were qualified for because they didn't meet every single qualification listed in the resume. Whereas men, 79% of men applied for jobs and they didn't even meet the bare minimum qualifications. So one of the things I think that we have to do is understand, and it's hard because when you're working in a space and you know that you have the education and potential, you continuously get passed by, it's just like a natural reaction to not think you're going to be good enough for the job. We have to recognize that you are qualified, and we also have to look at opportunities. We are looking at opportunities oftentimes, and we are putting in for jobs that we're overqualified for. To get over that imposter syndrome, you have to recognize, and as a community, what we need to do is start to celebrate the aspiration and the accomplishments of Black women in general. So understanding that you yourself, knowing your education, knowing your experience, knowing what you have done, put in for the job, regardless of whether or not you check off every single box. As long as you meet those basic qualifications, then apply for it. And if you feel like you did not get that job based and that you were discriminated against, let's just say you put in for the job and you don't get it. You always want to go back to ask the employer or the recruiter, whoever did the interview, why didn't I get the job and what could I have done to do better? And just to be transparent, I experienced that one time in my job where I applied for a job I was qualified for. I went back and I asked them, what could I have done? Because I knew the person, and we all know this, especially if you work in small organizations. Sometimes you do more than the person that got the job. You wonder, how the heck did they get that job over me? And when that employer gives you that feedback, if you have data to show, to support that you actually do have, or you did demonstrate that you met whatever qualifications that they didn't say, then you can use that to hold them accountable. And that's the second part of this. A lot of times, many of us are not holding organizations accountable, especially if you belong to a union. What happened at the Social Security Administration, if you look at, and this is very typical of many organizations, where you see Black women were overrepresented in middle management, but when you look at the very senior levels of executive leadership, or the C-suite, so to speak, they were not represented. And one of the things that I was able to do when I was on the federal executive board is to create a leadership pipeline program for women, because oftentimes what happens is there is a social capital aspect to moving up in the C-suite sometimes, especially if you have the education and the time and grade, I mean years of service to be able to move up. We have to start developing programs, and the Social Security Administration had something called the Black Affairs Advisory Council, and what it was, they're employee resource groups that cater to different demographics to address the specific needs of that demographic and the challenges that they face in the workplace specific to that organization. And so one of the things that they were able to do is create a mentorship program where they were paired with a senior executive in a job or in the office that they would aspire to be in, and that person worked with them to develop an individual development plan to help them move up. So the next question is, what should Black women say or do at their current jobs to get equal pay, and how do we start the conversation? Who do we have the conversation with? So the conversation on the individual level starts when you are being recruited in. It's always good to do your research. Some of this information is public, some of it is not public on what organizations are paying, depending on whether or not they are a 501c3 organization or not. But we have to, employers typically post what the salary range is for the job on their job announcement. And if they don't, when you're getting in the interview and you're past the screening and you're getting to the part where you're getting to the offer stage, it's an offer stage for a reason. 9 times out of 10, women are just accepting what's being offered to them instead of asking for what they want. Now, in the corporate space, it's really difficult on the individual level to know what your counterpart is making for the same job because that information is not publicly available. But they can disclose that information on the aggregate. But they won't do that until they know that you are going to land in the pool of people that they want to give an offer to. So my suggestion is you're going to talk to the human resource person. So you don't want to have that conversation necessarily with the first line supervisor because they don't know the aggregate pay data for the company. That's going to come from the Office of Human Resources or the recruitment office that is, sourcing you for that job. And in terms of structuring, how do we address the structural barriers for women that face increased employer monopoly power to exploit workers? If you could, is that Talia? If you could provide a little more context by what specifically what structural barrier you're talking about. I know for what comes to mind, I'll use Amazon for example. Amazon, when they shared their corporate data on demographics, most of the people of color were working in the warehouses and not actually in the corporate space. And so what needs to happen on that end is we have to continue to apply and continue to hold those organizations accountable. It's really difficult to try to hold an organization accountable if we aren't applying. And what they're saying is that people aren't applying. And we know that that's not necessarily true. We also have to make sure that there is representation on the corporate spaces and boards that are making the ranking determinations, selecting who moves to the next round. Studies show that when those bodies are diverse, African American women have a higher chance of landing the job. And another question that people don't like to ask in the interview is to, address the diversity on those teams, understanding what kind of environment you're going to be going in if you do accept that job. So those are important conversations that need to happen on the individual level. But collectively, what we need to do is make sure that if there are no employee resource groups, that is the first step, having the conversation of to have an employee resource group at any company, whether it's a federal organization or a corporate organization or a nonprofit. You need to have an executive sponsor. And if you don't have a relationship with an executive sponsor, you can partner with your supervisor to bring the idea up to have an employee resource group. And what those employee resource groups do is they challenge the company to look at their values and how those values are trickling down. Is diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and access a part of the organization's objective, vision, or mission statement? If it's not, then those conversations need to be had. And there needs to be a proposal put forth to demonstrate how the establishment of an employee resource group can help the company achieve its diversity goals. Now, we all know that the recent, Supreme Court ruling that challenged affirmative action basically said that whether it be for education or workplace, a person cannot make a decision on hiring somebody or accepting them into school solely on the basis of their race, and there could be no quotas or caps, which has always been illegal. And there's a misconception that because this policy was passed, all of the diversity, equity, inclusion agendas that have been established or the groups are going away, and that's just absolutely not true. For example, Suffolk Law School, in response to that Supreme Court ruling, created a scholarship fund to give people who graduated from HBCUs a full ride to law school to help curb that. And I'll put some links in the chat to this. To address the minimum wage qualifications and what we need to do on the federal level, we need to make sure that we are calling our senators and our congressional representatives to tell them to vote yes on the Paycheck Fairness Act. And I will put a link in the chat that has a script that you can follow. It's always great to provide your own story behind that to help move that legislator's heart and mind to vote a certain way. But I will put a link in the chat to that for an example of how we can move that policy forward. But outside of that, we also have to make sure that we're continuing to stand up mentorship programs and support networks. Mentorship programs that are connecting women with the experience of professionals to help them guide them in their career will also help with the imposter syndrome, and it will also help them understand what they need to do to navigate that particular space. It's so important to find an executive level person who looks like you and have an informal interview with them to ask them what did they do to advance to where they are in their career. And so outside of holding our policy makers accountable, we can use the buying power that we do have to continue to invest in Black-owned businesses, because we know that Black-owned businesses don't receive the venture capital that we need. And we know that when Black women businesses receive the capital that they need, they're hiring Black women to help them move the mission of those organizations. And so the more that we can do to help uplift everyone collectively, and it has to be a collective impact initiative, and it can't just be won by African-American women. We have to find allies, and what that means is individuals from other socioeconomic backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds to partner with us and to allow us to leverage their privilege and in their space and use their platform to tell our stories instead of the other way around. So outside of that, we have to make sure that we're continuing to hold our state legislator accountable. We have to make sure that our states are making the geographic region equitable enough so that certain occupations that are absent from our counties and our states are available. And that all that's done on the local level. And we have to make sure that when we are leaving communities, I know many of us may have grown up in communities that have been disadvantaged, and we found our way out of those communities and have moved on to more affluent communities, making sure that when we reach a level of success, that we don't leave those communities behind, but find a way to reach back to help pull them up. If I don't have access to an executive level Black woman, it looks like me and your company, can you get, yes, you can get mentorship outside your company. And, you know, it's so, if you don't, if you don't have access to an executive level Black woman in your company, just because you don't have the personal relationship and they are there, then I would leverage whatever social capital you do have in your organization to connect with them. And that could be a simple email introducing yourself and asking, can I have a coffee chat with you because I'm interested in learning about your career. If they are present, if an African American woman in an executive position is present and could be accessible if you had the relationship, especially if you want to move up in that company. And let's just say there aren't any, because it's true. You can still develop the relationships with senior executives who are not African American women, and, you know, bring it to the intention of your employer that whether that's human resources or if you have a great relationship with your supervisor, to ask them to advocate for these issues on your behalf, because directors and those in senior level positions that do have access to the C-suite can bring these issues to light on your behalf. You don't always have to be the person to advocate for yourself. And then we also have to use our unions if you are a member of the union. Most management officials are not members of the union. So once you become a member, a managerial official, you lose that privilege of having access to the union. But that's where the employee resource groups come in. It's so important to have those. There are many organizations out here that understand the importance of the employee resource groups. If you don't know how to start one up, I can also send a link for a resource. The Office of Personnel Management has a guide on how to start an employee resource group at your company if one does not exist. Can you, this next question, can you also talk about when women are asked if they have children or are married at the interview? I have found this, yes. So that's people shouldn't be asking any questions that aren't relevant to your ability to perform the job. And that's so important because that ties into the caregiver disparity. Lots of women who have infants or who need access to childcare are looked over or are pregnant are looked over because the employer thinks they're going to be absent from the job. But that's actually a question that is not relevant to your ability to perform the work. And so, you know, I would challenge that question being asked in a respectful way, because it's not relevant to you doing your job. According to a poll, Black women say their income is falling behind the cost of living wage. What can we do and how can we keep pace? That is so true. There was another study so there's something called the Opportunity Index, and what they look at is how much of your paycheck is being used to pay for whatever. And affordable housing is a crisis in the United States everywhere, not just here in the US, but also abroad. And what they found is on average, women with small children are using 49% of their pay to pay for rent. I mean, it's absurd. And so what we need to do to make sure that we are keeping pace, financial literacy is a real thing. There's a book called The Millionaire Next Door, and I think there are approximately 11 million retirement millionaires. And what I mean by that is people have reached millionaire status because of how they are investing in their 401k and their retirement. And so making sure that we're limiting our debt, our own personal debt, and really taking financial literacy seriously. We all know home ownership is a better route than renting, but sometimes people can't afford home ownership because, for example, the student debt crisis. The student debt crisis was something that Biden-Harris administration resolved this last year, where mortgage lenders cannot use your student loan debt as a factor to deny you for a mortgage payment. So we don't know this. And so we're not challenging, these, if you're getting a denial, they don't tell you why. We have to ask questions and hold people accountable to the policies again. So I will say that again. So student loan debt, right? When you apply for a mortgage, they were using student loan debt as by itself. You can have a great credit score, a high paying job, but the presence of a student loan debt over a certain amount to deny you for a mortgage. And that, based on the policies that the Biden-Harris administration passed, lenders should not be denying you on the basis of just your student loan debt. Now, if you are, a lot of people have what's called they use private loans to pay for their education. That's something different, but I'm talking about the federally backed money. When people apply for student aid and they have their direct federal loans, and a lot of people don't know about how to get those debts wiped off. For those of you who do have student loan debt and you've been paying over 20 years on those debts, you can ask for those debts to be forgiven, regardless of the Supreme Court decision that reversed the Department of Education's decision to try to wipe off loans. And so I will put all of these resources in the chat. The Biden administration puts out fact sheets recently on how to ask about that. So I know a couple of people who had their student loan debt wiped off. Unfortunately, I wasn't one of the ones that made it because I haven't had 20 years of payments. So I still have to pay my student loans. Let me see. Any other questions? Studies have shown that women and people of color are less likely to apply for jobs unless they believe they are able to perform everything. Yes, we talked about that. That is so important.
I just want to come off. I have a question.
Yeah.
Francis. So with everything going on and everything it seems stacked against Black women to work and take care of ourselves, or women of color, and have jobs that are upwardly mobile, how do you suggest that we counter that? What kinds of things can we do so that we can stay encouraged and basically counter that and not accept that as our norm?
Yeah, one of the things that we have to do, I think we have to take a note from some historical figures that have been able to continue to move the needle. We talk about Oprah Winfrey, and even look at some of the groups that are not African American. The one thing that we need to do, and this came out of the mouths of legislators on the other side that don't believe that Black women's wealth gap and equal pay is an issue, is we have to have, I like to call it one band, one sound. We really have to have, right now, there is no singular national agenda to put for the direction of the solution. And so what we have is, you have states doing one thing, you have the federal level doing one thing, and the local government doing another thing. We have to figure out a way, by leveraging either the Black Chambers of Commerce or whatever other entity, to make sure that there's a national Black agenda for women, period. Because unless we are, it's called collective impact. If you apply the solution just to the paycheck, that's not going to solve the wealth gap as it pertains to venture capital funding for Black women businesses. It's only going to solve the problem for minimum wage jobs where people are, where they're receiving a paycheck and they're an employee. So we really need to have a national Black agenda, and that a lot of organizations have been trying to do that. They've done it for men. It has not been done for Black women. So that is something that we need to challenge our national organizations or local organizations to do. We have to vote. I know people don't think voting is important, but a lot of these issues are policy driven. The people in the Supreme Court that made those decisions were put in those seats by the president that appointed them. So if we are not voting in every single election, I'm talking about your county councils, your general assemblies, and the gubernatorial and the presidential election, we have to vote, and we have to start investing our finances into the solution. So that means organizations, Black organizations coming together to try to start their own venture capital fund so that we can invest in Black businesses. I think there's 0.03% of Black venture capital firms. That's a problem. That means we're like non-existent. And I mean, funding is so important, but we also have to leverage telecom, the media. There are op-eds. If you Google, the Black wealth gap, most people that are telling the story on behalf of Black women are like Forbes, the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation. We need to make sure that this is not something that's on the back burner. A lot of women in the community don't know that they are a part of that wealth wage gap because they may be earning a six-figure salary. But just because you are earning a six-figure salary doesn't mean that you're not a part of that wealth wage gap, because 9 times out of 10, that woman that's earning a six-figure salary is doing it in maybe a more senior level or principal level management position when she really should be in senior executive service. But it goes back to that imposter syndrome and how we are viewing where we are and our comfort level and whether or not we deserve to be there. So there's a level of, not only is it's a policy issue, it's also a social equity issue within ourselves and how we are holding our own selves accountable to being a part of that solution. I know many of us on here are probably involved, but what about, your brother and your sister and your cousin and your aunt who are, how well versed are they about what's going on in society on this topic? And continuing to educate. The more people that we educate, and not just educating, Black women, we need to educate everyone and make them understand why it matters and what's in it for them. A lot of people don't want to be a part of something because they say, oh, well, I'm not Black, I don't think that impacts me, but it does. Because when we talk about a lot of people, especially policymakers, they get on the campaign stump and say, your education shouldn't be determined based on your zip code. Well, it is going to be, because your tax dollars determine what kind of funding is going to those zone schools. And so we need to make sure that we're educating people on these topics and really providing tangible examples of how the wealth wage gap for Black women is impacting the community at large.
And if I could just say also, for anyone who's not able to put their question in the chat, if you can raise your hand or I don't know if they can come off mute to ask Dr. Francis. I didn't want anyone's question to not get answered. If you don't have access to the chat, just raise your hand and I'll make sure that, we get to you so we can, you can have a chance to ask your question. So we have about 12 minutes left. So I wanted to make sure that, I don't see anybody's hand. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, and yeah, so that's, I mean, we have to really do, and so like organizations like Five Star Women, like what you are doing locally in the community, we need to encourage other people to become a part of what you're doing, to replicate what you're doing in other areas of the state, because it can't be done by one organization or group. It really has to be a national push where we're all saying the same thing. That's why you notice sometimes when people are trying to push for policy, they'll circulate around a script because they want people to say the same thing because it will resonate. And a lot of times people don't understand, like I know during election season, I do a lot in that space. And when we're knocking on doors trying to encourage people to vote, they're like, my vote doesn't count. It doesn't matter. Every single vote matters. If people don't know, the county executive in Baltimore County currently was elected off 17 votes. 17 people helped push him into that seat. And so we need to do more to make sure that women are, running for offices, that they're represented in every level of government. We also need to address the monopoly question earlier before. We need to make sure that women are represented on corporate boards, which are paid positions. People don't know how to access those things. And so it's so important to start joining organizations like your Chamber of Commerce. If you are a Black-owned business and you're trying to earn government contracts or grants and you can't land venture capital firm funding to become a member of SCORE, which is the SBA Small Business Administration's program that they set up to mentor new entrepreneurs and teach them what to do and open up and expand their network. We need to make sure that we're asking our county councils and our state governments to continue to earmark funding for minority business enterprises and making sure that when we are starting those businesses that we're doing our due diligence to get those certifications. A lot of people also don't know there are billions of dollars in government contracting, but Black businesses are shut out of that because they don't know how to get the past performance to compete for those jobs. And the Department of Justice and the Department of Commerce 2 months ago stood up a program to teach Black businesses on how to start to win government contracting. A lot of people don't know the protege process and how you can, like the Deloittes and the Accentures and those large Fortune 500 companies that have been dominating, monopolizing this space. Also, when they win federal government contracts, they have a duty. Sometimes in those contracts, they have to disperse a portion of that through subcontracts to small minority, veteran-owned, and disadvantaged businesses. But we don't know how to access those opportunities. So continuing to share that information, holding free workshops, because a lot of these workshops that are out here to teach people how to secure funding, you have to pay for astronomical amounts of money, like $495. I've seen, many different prices. And, if people are struggling to get their business off the ground, they don't have the money to pay for another course. So continuing to make these resources free and available to our community members and people in the underrepresented groups are so important. And what I'll do, I will so the startup funding. So the Small Business Administration, there are lots of organizations that have startup funding. There are lots of conglomerates that are sourcing information pools to source information for different kinds of funding. But the Small Business Administration has a program to help depending on what sector your business is falling in, they work with you from startup to launch to post revenue phase. And so there are lots of different programs. It depends on where you are and if you're in pre-revenue phase or not, if you're doing a service or a product, depending on what program you will fall in. But you can access just basic bare minimum mentorship through an organization called SCORE. And every chapter, or every state has a chapter, a SCORE chapter. And what they'll do is they'll teach you everything from your business plan to your financial, how to develop your financial information sheet for when you're trying to seek venture capital. They'll teach you how to pitch for funding. And then depending on whether or not you enroll in certain, whatever the various programs, they have hundreds of programs. A part of graduating from those programs, you can get access to grant funding upwards of $50,000 to $100,000 or more, depending on the space that you are in. And so what I'll do at the close of this, Makeda, I'll just send you just a whole rundown, just a one sheet of all of the resources and explain what you should be going to these resources for. You can disseminate them out to everyone and they can continue to share.
Yep, that'll be perfect. And then that way we can send that out to everybody. Certainly. Great. Let's see.
Yeah, and so with that, I will just close by saying at the minimum what you can do right now, like tomorrow morning when you wake up, because now if you haven't been paying attention, there is now a Speaker of the House that was voted in today in Congress. So the Paycheck Fairness Act will be on the docket for a vote. We want them to pass that. That's going to be one of the things we can do to continuously chip away at this problem. And I will, I'm just going to post, I'm going to still send this now, but I'm going to post this in the chat now just so you can walk away with it as a resource.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Are there any additional questions? I do see, yes. Mary asked to include the Commerce Department info. And oh, great.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Francis. And could you just explain what it is that you just posted in there?
Yes, this is the Paycheck Fairness Act, and this is the bill that is going to specifically address the wealth. I mean the cents to the dollar. That how we talked about women are making 57, depending on your social economic to $1. This is going to actually hold those organizations and agencies accountable and require them to produce data to show that they are paying a fair wage. Because the one thing about public policy is once a policy passes, many times policies pass but don't have an accountability mechanism to hold organizations accountable for violating the Equal Pay Act.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we got all the questions. We are just so appreciative that you had the time to join us and that you took the time to share your wisdom with us. We are going to make sure that the links that you referenced get out to everyone after this. And for as Dakisha just said, thank you so much for your time and pouring. That's important, like you talked about.
Thank you.
Sharing information with us. Oh, I like that, the cup.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that means a lot because that's the only way that we can learn and grow, and one, to acknowledge what's going on, and then now once we know what's going on, to do something about it. So that's our goal. And I wanted to share with everyone also that we will have a conference coming up November 30th. It's Empowered Women's Conference, and we'll make sure that we share that because we have some great people who are going to be speaking. One of them is on here tonight, Sharon Blake, who will be speaking about
I know Sharon Blake.
Who'll
Yes.
be, speaking about education and the importance of that. So we are grateful that we have such powerful women such as yourself in this community, who are able to pour into us. So with that, we thank everybody. We are right on time.
Awesome.
So Shalima, was there anything you'd like to say to close us out?
Now, I just want to say thank you, everyone, especially thank you to Dr. Crystal Francis. I learned a lot tonight, and I think some of this information I didn't know, so it was definitely empowering to me. I want to thank everyone who took time out to get on the call, and look out for more information from 5 Star. Thank you.
Awesome.
Excellent. Thank you. With that, we will say
Bye.
good night. Take care.
Good night.
Good night. Good
Thanks.
night.